Okay, think about this for a second. Imagine just one little change in history that could completely flip our world upside down. That's what we're doing today. We're diving into a huge what if. What if the United States had been colonized by Spain?
Seriously, what if the language you're hearing right now wasn't English, but Spanish? From coast to coast? What if the whole culture, the religion, the entire American identity was shaped by Madrid, not London? The knock-on effects are just staggering. So yeah, let's explore this alternate America.
So on one side, you've got the history we all learned in school, right? The one with English roots. And on the other, this alternate path, one carved out by the Spanish Empire. By putting them side by side, we can really start to see just how unbelievably different our world might look today.
Okay, so before we jump into the what if, we've got to set the stage. We need to look at what actually happened. What was the original English blueprint that made the United States what it is today?
Well, the English blueprint gave us a few huge things. The language, obviously, a predominantly Protestant culture. But here's the real kicker. It planted the seeds for representative government. See, the colonies had a lot of freedom to rule themselves. They set up their own local assemblies and had this really strong sense of their rights as Englishmen. And that's going to be super important later on.
And, this whole idea isn't as crazy as it might sound. Spain wasn't just some small country trying its luck. They were a colonial giant. They had this massive, super wealthy empire all over the Americas. So is it really that much of a stretch to think they could have just pushed north? If they had, man, what kind of America would we be looking at?
Right, so the first things to change, and probably the biggest, would be cultural. It all starts with the basics. What you hear on the street every day, the whole rhythm of life. We're talking faith and language.
And this is the absolute ground floor of the whole thing. Instead of English and Protestantism, the entire cultural foundation becomes Spanish and Catholicism. And listen, this is way more than just what church you go to. This would have shaped everything: laws, holidays, how families work, the whole shebang.
Even the cities themselves would look totally different. Picture it. American cities built around a big central plaza with a massive cathedral right in the middle. A public square made for people to gather for festivals. The buildings themselves would tell a different story, one that's way more about community and faith.
And that faith, it would have been tied directly to the government. There was this system called the Patronato Real, which basically gave the Spanish king huge control over the Catholic Church in the Americas. So you get this complete fusion of church and state. It's the total opposite of the English model, right? Where a lot of people were coming over specifically to escape state religion, not to build it up.
So we've covered language and faith, but it goes deeper. The actual people in this alternate America would be totally different. The demographics? A completely different story.
Here's the key difference in how they settled the land, and it's a big one. The English, they tended to show up as whole families. They built their towns and, for the most part, stayed pretty separate from the native populations. But the Spanish approach was different. It was mostly men who came over, soldiers, settlers. And when they wanted to start a family, they married indigenous women. And look, this isn't just some historical guesswork. We can actually see the results of this in the DNA of people in Latin America today. Mexico is a perfect example. Just check this out. When you look at the maternal ancestry, that's the mother side of the family, it is overwhelmingly Native American. We're talking almost 93%. That is the genetic fingerprint right there of those early Spanish men starting families with indigenous women.
Okay, but now flip it around. Look at the paternal ancestry, the father's line. Almost 65% European. So you put those two pieces of data together and the picture is crystal clear. This was a society built from day one on the blending of European men and indigenous women.
So here's the bottom line. A Spanish America would have been a mestizo nation, a mixed-race society right from the get-go. It would have been a place defined by blending, both culturally and genetically. And that is a world away from the story of separation and displacement that we see in so much of Anglo-American history.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about power and money. How would this place have been governed? And what would its economy have looked like?
And when it comes to government, the difference is night and day. Remember how the English colonies had their own local assemblies and a lot of home rule? Well, forget all that. Spain ruled with an iron fist, and they did it from thousands of miles away. All power was centralized. It flowed straight from the king in Spain down to the colonies. There was just no room for local folks to govern themselves.
This is how the chain of command worked.
You had the king on top, he appointed a viceroy who was basically a royal governor for the whole territory, then that viceroy would manage a bunch of regional provinces. It was a super rigid top-down system. And it wasn't designed to give people freedom, it was designed for control and to pull wealth out of the land.
And the economy. It was built on a pretty brutal system of forced labor called the encomienda. Basically, Spanish conquistadors were given the rights to the labor of entire native communities. Now, on paper, they were supposed to protect them and teach them Christianity, but in reality, it was just a brutal system of exploitation, and a lot of the time, it was basically slavery.
And the consequences of that whole top-down, extractive model, they've lasted for centuries. Get this, a study from the University of Bath found that even today, that colonial legacy has seriously hurt educational outcomes. We're talking a 17 percentage point drop in secondary school enrollment compared to other colonies. That's a huge, long-lasting impact.
So what's the big takeaway here? Let's pull all these pieces together and think about the absolutely massive ripple effect this one change would have sent across the entire world.
So, to sum it all up, this alternate U.S. would be a completely different animal. It'd be a Catholic, Spanish-speaking country. The people would be mostly mestizo, that blend of European and indigenous ancestry. The government would be highly centralized, and the culture? Probably a lot more focused on community and less on that rugged individualism we associate with the American frontier.
But here it is, the single biggest consequence of all. Without that English tradition of self-rule, of individual rights, of representative government, the very ideas that fueled the American Revolution just wouldn't be there. No revolution means no United States as we know it. And that would change everything about the last 250 years of world history.
It just goes to show you, history isn't some straight line. It's more like a fragile chain of events, where if you change just one link, you get a totally new reality. It really makes you wonder, right? What other single moment, what other little roll of the dice could have changed absolutely everything?